January 17th, 1942. Northern Siberia. The temperature had fallen below -40 degrees during the night. Frost covered the canvas roofs of supply wagons like powdered glass. Far beyond the last settlement, where the forest swallowed sound and the sky faded into a pale iron gray, men stood beside a frozen embankment waiting for the machine to arrive. At first, they heard nothing. Then came the vibration. A deep, metallic tremor rolled beneath the ice-packed ground. Snow drifted from pine branches. Somewhere in the white distance, steam rose above the trees, and then it emerged. Steel wheels taller than a man. Riveted armor plates blackened by soot. Chains grinding through frozen mud. Exhaust smoke pouring upward into the Arctic air. The workers called it the Iron Monster, not because it was a weapon, but because it moved like one. Its purpose was brutally simple: cut a railroad through wilderness that human beings were never meant to conquer. The machine crushed rock hardened by permafrost. It dragged entire rail sections across frozen valleys. Men disappeared beneath collapsing earth beside it. Others froze while feeding coal into its furnace through the night. But the railway had to move forward, because somewhere far to the west, the war was already consuming nations faster than factories could replace them. And deep inside the frozen wilderness, steel had become as important as bullets. By the winter of 1941, the Soviet Union was fighting for survival. Operation Barbarossa had shattered the western frontier only months earlier. German armored columns had crossed rivers, overrun industrial cities, and pushed hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory with terrifying speed. Entire rail hubs vanished beneath retreating smoke. Freight depots burned. Bridges collapsed behind withdrawing Soviet engineers trying desperately to slow the advance. But geography itself now became part of the war. The Soviet Union possessed something Germany did not fully understand in those first months: depth. Endless distance. Thousands of kilometers of forests, tundra, rivers, mountains, and frozen wilderness stretching far beyond Europe's industrial heartlands. Factories could be dismantled in the west, loaded onto trains, and rebuilt east of the Ural Mountains where German bombers could no longer reach them. The problem was not simply moving factories. The problem was moving everything: coal, steel, oil, ammunition, food, replacement engines, entire divisions of soldiers, millions of civilians fleeing west to east ahead of the advancing front. And every kilometer depended on railroads. Soviet military logistics during the Second World War were tied almost entirely to rail transport. Trucks were limited. Roads vanished beneath mud during spring Rasputitsa seasons. Rivers froze. Fuel shortages spread constantly across the front. Rail became the bloodstream of the state itself. Without rail movement, armies stopped fighting. Without rail movement, factories stopped producing. Without rail movement, entire cities starved. Inside Moscow, Soviet planners understood this with brutal clarity. German forces were advancing faster than damaged rail lines could be repaired. Existing routes were overloaded beyond capacity. Entire sections of track in Western territories had been destroyed during retreat operations to prevent German use, so attention turned eastward, toward the frozen territories, toward regions where almost no large-scale infrastructure existed, toward landscapes that seemed immune to civilization itself. Across Siberia and the northern wilderness, survey teams moved through forests, carrying measuring equipment beside horse-drawn sleds. Engineers studied old imperial maps dating back decades. Some routes had once been proposed during the final years of the Russian Empire, but abandoned because conditions were too severe and costs too extreme. War changed those calculations. What had once seemed economically impossible now became strategically necessary. The Soviet state needed new extraction routes for iron ore, timber, coal, nickel, and oil hidden beneath remote northern territories. Industrial evacuation eastward had created enormous pressure on supply networks already stretched across continents. Military command demanded rail access to regions where factories, mines, and labor camps were rapidly expanding. But frozen wilderness did not surrender easily. The farther north construction crews traveled, the more hostile the terrain became. Permafrost hardened the ground into layers stronger than concrete during winter, then transformed into unstable swamp during summer thaw. Heavy machinery sank into mud fields without warning. Timber bridges cracked under shifting ice. Explosives behaved unpredictably in severe cold. Diesel fuel thickened. Hydraulic systems failed. Metal became brittle enough to fracture under stress. Human beings suffered even more. Workers endured temperatures capable of freezing exposed skin within minutes. Fingers stuck to steel surfaces. Lungs burned with every breath. Frostbite spread silently beneath gloves and boots. Entire camps vanished beneath blizzards that erased roads, tracks, and landmarks overnight. Yet construction never stopped, because every delay at the railway meant shortages somewhere else. Somewhere, soldiers waited for ammunition that had not arrived. Somewhere, factories sat idle without coal deliveries. Somewhere, another city rationed bread thinner than the week before. And so the state turned increasingly toward enormous industrial machines capable of replacing thousands of laborers at once. Massive steam-powered excavators, tracked earth movers, armored rotary plows, heavy rail haulers built to survive conditions that destroyed ordinary equipment within weeks. Most workers never knew the official engineering designations of these machines. They gave them simpler names instead: the Iron Beasts, the Snow Crushers, the Iron Monsters. And among them stood one machine in particular that became infamous across frozen construction sectors: a giant rail-laying and earth-cutting system, so large and violent in operation that workers compared its arrival to artillery moving through the forest. Its crews operated around the clock. Its furnace consumed mountains of coal. Its steel-cutting blades screamed against frozen earth day and night. And wherever it advanced, the wilderness changed forever. But long before the machine reached full operation, another reality was taking shape behind the rail expansion itself. A reality built not only on engineering, but on human exhaustion, forced labor, and sacrifice hidden beneath the snow. The Soviet rail expansion into the northern wilderness was not built under normal conditions. It was built under emergency conditions. By late 1941 and early 1942, Soviet leadership no longer viewed infrastructure as a long-term economic project. Rail construction had become a wartime survival operation. Entire ministries were reorganized around transportation output. Engineers were transferred directly from civilian industries into military-controlled logistics programs. Locomotive production received priority over countless consumer industries that effectively disappeared during the war years. Everything was redirected toward movement: movement of steel, movement of fuel, movement of armies, and movement through territory that resisted every attempt to tame it. The farther east and north construction teams advanced, the less existing infrastructure they could rely upon. Roads often ended hundreds of kilometers before survey zones began. Machinery had to be dismantled and transported by temporary narrow-gauge rail sections, river barges, sled convoys, or primitive winter roads carved directly across frozen lakes. Sometimes the machines arrived before food supplies, sometimes before shelter. Construction camps emerged in brutal stages. First came surveyors marking routes through forests and marshlands. Then, logging crews clearing trees with axes, saws, and explosives. After them came excavation teams, bridge workers, rail crews, mechanics, furnace operators, cooks, guards, medics, and supply detachments. At the center of many of these projects stood giant industrial excavation systems, unlike anything local workers had seen before. Some were adapted from mining machinery.
Others were heavily modified steam excavators originally intended for peacetime industrial development. Soviet engineers reinforced them with insulated piping, armored housings, oversized boilers, and specialized traction systems designed for frozen ground. They were not elegant machines. They were brutal machines, heavy, loud, dangerous, perfect for war. The so-called Iron Monster, operating along several northern rail sectors, was a colossal rail-mounted excavation and hauling system built to cut embankments, clear frozen debris, move rail material, and prepare foundations for track-laying crews behind it. Workers described its enormous steel wheels throwing sparks across ice during nighttime operations. Steam pressure echoed through valleys like distant artillery fire.
The machine rarely stopped moving. Its operators worked in rotating shifts because halting operations carried risks of its own. Boilers could freeze. Pressure systems could crack. Metal components contracted violently in Arctic temperatures. Restarting the system after shutdown often required hours of reheating and maintenance, so the furnaces stayed alive. Continuously, coal crews fed the fireboxes through blizzards while mechanics hammered frozen joints with heated tools. Ice formed inside workers' eyelashes while they shoveled ash beneath the machine's undercarriage. Steam leaked constantly around valves and pipes, covering operators in layers of frost before dawn. And still the railway crawled forward, meter by meter. The human cost became enormous. Thousands of laborers were drawn from different parts of Soviet society. Some were skilled industrial workers, evacuated from Western cities. Some were military engineering units. Others were prisoners from Gulag labor systems assigned to remote construction sectors where manpower shortages had become critical. Conditions varied from project to project, but many shared the same pattern. Long shifts, minimal shelter, extreme cold, constant accidents. Medical reports from wartime rail sectors described crushed limbs beneath track sections, steam burns from ruptured valves, exposure deaths during snowstorms, and collapses caused by exhaustion and malnutrition. Workers handling explosives often suffered permanent hearing damage. Frostbite amputations became routine in isolated camps, lacking proper winter equipment, and yet output targets continued increasing because the war kept growing larger. By 1942, German offensives toward the Caucasus threatened Soviet oil supplies. Industrial evacuation programs still required huge transportation capacity. Lend-lease shipments arriving through Arctic ports needed inland rail, movement toward manufacturing, centers, and frontline distribution hubs. Every additional rail connection mattered. Single completed section could reduce supply delays by days. A repaired bridge could restore movement to entire sectors. 1. Functioning line could determine whether factories remained operational during winter production cycles. This pressure transformed engineering decisions into matters of state survival. Speed became more important than comfort. Completion became more important than safety. In some frozen sectors, tracks were laid over unstable ground simply because there was no time to build deeper foundations. Crews returned later to repair sections warped by thawing earth. Temporary timber supports replaced permanent structures that wartime shortages could not yet provide. The machines compensated where manpower failed. The Iron Monster and others, like it dragged rails across terrain, that horse. Teams could barely cross. Massive cutting systems carved through frozen embankments that would have taken hundreds of workers weeks to clear manually. Steam-powered cranes lifted bridge materials in temperatures, where exposed hydraulic systems often failed completely, but The machines created fear as much as admiration. Workers knew how dangerous they were. Visibility around them vanished beneath steam clouds and blowing snow. Their steel cables snapped with explosive force under tension. Their gears crushed clothing, tools, and sometimes human bodies within seconds. Men disappeared beneath moving track. Assemblies during night operations illuminated only by furnace glow and weak flood lamps. The wilderness itself seemed to consume the dead quietly. Frozen ground often prevented proper burial until spring. Some rail workers later described entire stretches of northern railway as graveyards hidden beneath snow and stone. Yet, despite the suffering, the lines expanded. Industrial trains began reaching territories once considered unreachable during winter months. Mining settlements grew around new rail connections. Supply corridors stabilized east of the Urals. Reinforcements and equipment moved faster toward threatened fronts. And slowly, almost invisibly at first, the Soviet logistical system began recovering from the catastrophe of 1941. But recovery alone would not decide the war, because eventually, every railway led toward the front, and there, far beyond the forests and frozen labor camps, the full importance of these monstrous machines would finally reveal itself. For most workers, the iron monster did not represent progress. It represented survival. The machine dominated every construction sector where it operated. Its arrival changed the rhythm of entire camps. Sleep schedules shifted around its maintenance cycles. Coal deliveries were prioritized for its furnace. Rail crews waited for it to clear embankments before laying track behind it. Mechanics worked under armed supervision, because a single failure could halt transport schedules across hundreds of kilometers. But beneath the statistics and engineering reports stood ordinary people forced into extraordinary conditions. Many had never seen Arctic wilderness before the war. Factory. Workers from Kiev. Rail technicians from Minsk. Rural laborers from distant villages. Convicts transferred from overcrowded prison systems. Teenagers assigned to wartime labor brigades after older workers left for military service. They entered a world ruled entirely by cold. The cold determined when tools shattered. The cold determined whether fuel lines functioned. The cold determined whether a man woke up alive inside his bunk. Workers wrapped cloth around boots to survive longer shifts. Some stuffed newspaper beneath jackets for insulation. Others slept beside furnace rooms because barracks walls froze solid during storms. Hot food became more valuable than wages. Dry gloves became more valuable than cigarettes. The machine itself became strangely human in their minds. Not friendly, not trusted, but alive. Crews learned its moods through sound. They recognized boiler pressure changes by vibration beneath the tracks. They could hear frozen bearings before failure occurred. Furnace operators judged internal heat from the color of steam escaping valves into night air. A careless crew could die beside it, but one maintenance report from a northern rail sector described a pressure rupture during sub-zero operations that killed multiple workers instantly when superheated. Steam burst through a frozen pipe assembly. Another recorded cable failures that snapped through nearby labor teams with the effect of artillery fragments. Yet, even after fatal accidents, operations resumed quickly. The war allowed little time for mourning. Bodies were removed, damaged components replaced. The machine continued forward. Some workers developed a grim respect for it. Others feared it completely. Several survivor memoirs from wartime rail construction later described giant excavation systems as iron animals that consumed men as easily as they consumed fuel. and in many ways, that comparison was accurate. The machine required constant feeding. Coal, water, steel parts. Human energy. Without them, it stopped. Without it, the railway stopped. And without the railway, entire military sectors risked collapse. This understanding created a brutal psychological pressure inside construction camps. Workers knew their suffering connected directly to the wider war. Every frozen rail section carried ammunition. Every completed bridge carried tanks. Every repaired supply corridor strengthened Soviet resistance somewhere closer to the front. For many, endurance became its own form of combat. Not against German soldiers directly, against exhaustion, against weather, against machinery powerful, enough to kill through a single mistake. And while laborers fought the environment beneath the machine, Soviet engineers faced a different battle entirely. The battle of forcing industrial technology to function where nature itself seemed designed to destroy it. The greatest enemy of northern rail construction was not always distance. It was instability, frozen. Ground appeared solid during winter months, but Arctic terrain behaved unpredictably beneath heavy industrial weight. Permafrost trapped moisture beneath the surface in layers that shifted violently when disturbed. Excavation sometimes accelerated thawing beneath rail foundations, causing entire sections of newly completed track to buckle or sink. Conventional European rail building methods often failed completely in these regions. Engineers adapted through necessity. Timber mats were laid beneath machinery to spread weight across unstable ground. Elevated embankments reduced heat transfer into frozen soil. Drainage trenches diverted meltwater during seasonal thaw periods. Specialized steel alloys were introduced where ordinary components fractured under severe cold. The Iron Monster embodied many of these wartime improvisations, unlike standard excavation systems designed for temperate climates. It operated as a hybrid machine, part steam excavator, part rail hauler, part mobile industrial platform. Its immense weight provided traction across packed ice while reinforced drive systems allowed movement through partially frozen mud sectors that trapped lighter equipment. Steam power proved especially important. Diesel engines frequently struggled in extreme cold conditions during the early 1940s. Fuel thickened, batteries weakened rapidly, lubricants hardened inside moving systems. Steam machinery, while inefficient and maintenance-heavy, offered one critical advantage: heat. As long as the furnace remained active, operators could maintain pressure and keep vital components functioning. But this solution created new dangers. Boiler systems operated continuously under severe environmental stress. Pressure fluctuations became deadly in freezing temperatures where metal expanded and contracted repeatedly. Pipe insulation often failed after prolonged exposure. Water systems froze unexpectedly. Crews carried heated tools specifically to free jammed valves and fractured joints during emergency repairs. Visibility also became a constant operational hazard. Steam clouds mixed with snow and darkness, reducing sight lines around moving equipment to only a few meters. Signal systems relied heavily on whistles, lanterns, and shouted commands that storms frequently drowned out. Night operations became especially dangerous because wartime production schedules rarely allowed machinery to stop after sunset. Still, despite breakdowns and casualties, the technology worked, not perfectly, not safely, but effectively enough. The machine transformed impossible terrain into usable corridors. Rail output increased. Construction timelines shortened. Supply movement stabilized across regions previously considered inaccessible during winter, and gradually, Soviet logistical planners began understanding something larger. The frozen wilderness was no longer just empty territory. It was becoming infrastructure. Infrastructure capable of feeding factories, sustaining armies, and supporting a war that was growing into the largest industrial conflict in human history. But beyond engineering and labor stood another force shaping the entire project, the leadership that demanded results, no matter the cost. Inside Soviet wartime command structures, railroads were treated almost like frontline weapons. Generals measured offensives in kilometers of supply movement. Industrial ministries calculated factory survival through rail capacity reports. Every delay in transportation echoed outward through ammunition shortages, fuel rationing, and production slowdowns across the entire Soviet war machine. This pressure reached the engineers and administrators responsible for Northern rail construction. Deadlines became absolute. Failure became dangerous. The Soviet state during the war rewarded results with extraordinary authority, but it punished delays with equal severity. Managers overseeing strategic rail sectors understood that poor output could trigger investigations, demotions, arrests, or accusations of sabotage. In an atmosphere shaped by wartime paranoia and emergency planning, excuses carried little protection. So production targets kept rising. Construction brigades were ordered to continue through blizzards that halted visibility completely. Machinery remained operational far beyond normal maintenance limits. Temporary rail sections were approved, despite structural weaknesses, because supply schedules could not wait for ideal engineering conditions. The Iron Monster became central to this system of pressure. Reports from northern sectors frequently measured progress around the machine's operational status. If it advanced, the line advanced. If it stopped, hundreds of workers behind it stalled immediately. Entire schedules depended on one moving mass of steel surviving conditions that destroyed ordinary equipment. Commanders therefore treated it almost as a strategic asset. Security around critical machinery increased. In several sectors during the war years, spare parts were guarded carefully because replacement components were difficult to transport across remote wilderness. Skilled operators received food priorities and better winter gear in some camps simply because experienced crews were nearly impossible to replace quickly. But leadership itself remained divided over the human cost. Some Soviet engineers argued repeatedly for slower construction and stronger foundations, warning that rushed rail lines would fail during seasonal thawing. Others demanded additional medical support and reduced labor hours after casualty rates climbed in isolated sectors. The war rarely allowed such requests to succeed. German offensives continued. Industrial evacuation remained unfinished. Frontline commanders demanded faster delivery schedules. Arctic ports handling Allied Lend-Lease shipments required inland transportation immediately. The railway had to move forward, no matter how many men collapsed beside it. This relentless urgency created a strange contradiction within the Soviet system. Official propaganda celebrated rail workers as heroes, conquering nature through collective sacrifice. Newspapers described northern construction projects as symbols of industrial determination. Posters showed smiling workers beneath giant machines driving steel tracks toward victory. Reality looked very different. Workers disappeared from camps after accidents with little documentation. Frostbite permanently crippled laborers considered medically replaceable. Prison labor detachments absorbed some of the harshest assignments because human exhaustion could be replenished faster than damaged. Machinery. The wilderness concealed much of it. Storms buried abandoned equipment. Remote camps vanished. After projects ended, mass graves remained frozen beneath the ground, and over time, the machine itself became both symbol and warning. To planners in Moscow, it represented industrial power overcoming impossible geography. To many workers, it represented something colder, a system willing to grind human bodies into the frozen earth for the sake of steel and deadlines. Yet even this brutal machinery faced an enemy more powerful than politics or ideology, nature itself, because in the northern wilderness, the environment fought every kilometer of railroad with relentless force. Spring thaw transformed frozen construction zones into oceans of mud capable of swallowing heavy equipment whole. Timber foundations shifted unpredictably beneath warming soil. Newly completed embankments collapsed under their own weight after hidden ice layers melted beneath them. Entire rail sections had to be rebuilt repeatedly. Blizzards buried tracks faster than crews could clear them. Ice storms snapped telegraph lines and froze switching mechanisms. Rivers destroyed temporary bridges during breakup seasons when enormous sheets of moving ice crushed support, structures like kindling. Even the iron monster struggled. Immense weight became dangerous during thaw periods. When ground stability disappeared, crews laid temporary timber roads ahead of its movement only to watch them sink beneath mud within hours. Steam systems consumed enormous amounts of water in regions where liquid water itself became difficult to access during deep freezes. And then there was isolation, a mechanical failure. Near major cities could be repaired within days. A failure in the Arctic. Wilderness became a crisis. Replacement. Parts traveled enormous distances through incomplete rail systems. Medical evacuations often took weeks. Fuel shortages stranded work crews in temperatures capable of killing exposed men overnight. Many workers later described the wilderness not as scenery, but as an active force constantly trying to erase human presence. Trees reclaimed abandoned camps rapidly during summer months. Snow buried machinery during winter. Rivers carried away unfinished bridges. The land itself resisted permanence, and still, somehow, the railways expanded, slowly, violently, at terrible cost. By late 1942 and into 1943, the strategic impact of these northern and eastern rail systems became increasingly visible across the wider war. Soviet industrial recovery accelerated. Resource extraction stabilized. Reinforcements moved more efficiently between distant sectors. The lines carved through frozen wilderness were no longer experimental projects. They had become arteries of survival, and soon, the true test of everything built beside the iron monster would arrive, a moment when supply, timing, machinery, and human endurance would collide under the pressure of war itself. November 1942. The eastern rail sectors had entered their most dangerous phase. By now, the war had consumed entire regions of Europe. German forces were locked in brutal fighting around Stalingrad. Soviet industry, much of it relocated eastward during the previous year, was finally beginning to recover its production rhythm. Tank factories beyond the Urals operated day and night. Ammunition output climbed steadily. New divisions formed deep behind the front. But production alone meant nothing without transport. Weapons had to move west. Fuel had to move west. Men had to move west, and winter was closing in again. Inside, Soviet transportation ministries. Reports warned that existing rail capacity was reaching collapse levels. Several major routes remained damaged from earlier evacuations and German attacks. Seasonal weather threatened supply consistency across multiple sectors. Delays measured in hours near key junctions now affected. Operations hundreds of kilometers away. The northern rail projects suddenly became critical. Lines once considered secondary infrastructure, were now expected to carry strategic freight under emergency wartime schedules. Every unfinished section represented a bottleneck inside the Soviet logistical system. Pressure intensified immediately. Construction. Brigades received orders to accelerate completion before the deepest winter conditions arrived. Supply trains carrying rails, bridge materials, and coal moved continuously toward frozen construction zones. Maintenance crews were reorganized into 24-hour rotations. At the center of one major northern sector stood the Iron Monster. By this stage of the war, the machine had already become infamous across multiple rail camps. Workers recognized its thunderous approach long before it appeared through snowstorms. Its operators rarely slept more than a few hours between shifts. Furnace crews shoveled coal almost continuously to maintain steam pressure during the worsening cold. The machine's assignment was brutally simple: force a permanent rail corridor through a frozen valley system before winter storms sealed the region completely. Failure would isolate critical supply movement for months. Success would open a direct transport route capable of moving industrial freight toward Western military sectors at unprecedented speed. The terrain ahead was nearly impossible. Permafrost hardened the ground into rock-like layers beneath deep snow. Steep embankments lined sections of the valley. Frozen rivers cut across planned track routes. Explosive teams struggled to fracture. Earth solidified. By months of Arctic cold, ordinary excavation equipment had already failed repeatedly. The Iron Monster advanced anyway. Its cutting systems screamed against frozen stone while steam burst from pressure vents into black winter skies. Work lights illuminated walls of blowing snow around the machine at night, making it appear less like industrial equipment and more like a moving furnace, dragging steel through darkness. Workers followed directly behind it. Track crews laid rail sections almost immediately after the machine cleared ground ahead. Timber teams reinforced unstable sections before frost shifts cracked new foundations apart. Mechanics crawled beneath moving assemblies to repair damage without halting operations because every shutdown risked catastrophic freezing inside the steam systems. Accidents multiplied. One rail report from the period described workers freezing beside stalled freight wagons while trying to clear blocked lines during a blizzard. Another documented embankment collapses beneath. Overloaded construction equipment after hidden ice layers fractured underground. Still, the orders remained unchanged. Advance. Every completed kilometer mattered now. Soviet planners preparing winter offensives depended heavily on stable logistical support. Rail corridors connecting industrial regions to Western fronts allowed reserves, artillery ammunition, replacement tanks, and fuel supplies to move faster than Germany expected. In war, transportation often decided battles long before soldiers fired weapons. And by late 1942, the Soviet Union was beginning to master transportation again. The Iron Monster became one small but crucial piece inside that larger transformation. Night after night, it pushed deeper into the frozen valley. Its steel wheels, cracked ice beneath impossible weight, its furnace glow reflected against snow-covered forests. Its crews worked through temperatures capable of killing exposed men within minutes. Then came the storm. Meteorological records from northern sectors during that winter described severe Arctic systems sweeping across rail construction regions with hurricane-level winds and blinding snowfall. Entire work camps lost visibility beyond a few meters. Communication lines collapsed. Supply convoys disappeared along temporary winter roads. The storm struck while the machine operated inside one of the narrowest sections of the valley. Visibility vanished almost instantly. Flood lamps reflected back against airborne snow, turning darkness into a wall of white static. Wind howled through exposed steel structures, hard enough to drown warning whistles. Ice formed across moving gears and cable systems within minutes, but stopping the machine carried its own danger. If steam pressure failed, the entire system risked freezing solid, so the operators continued forward, slowly, blindly. Workers moved beside the tracks carrying lanterns almost invisible through the storm. Mechanics hacked ice from pressure valves with heated tools. Coal crews stumbled through snowdrifts to keep the furnace alive, while wind ripped heat away faster than the boilers could generate it. Then, somewhere ahead in the darkness, the ground shifted. At first, it sounded like distant thunder beneath the snow. And then, the valley began collapsing beneath the tracks. The sound came from underneath the railway, a deep, cracking roar beneath the frozen ground. For weeks, engineers had warned about instability inside the valley. Beneath the snow and hardened surface layers, sections of the terrain concealed partially frozen water channels trapped under pressure. Continuous excavation, steam heat from machinery, and the weight of construction traffic had weakened the permafrost holding the embankment together. Now, during the middle of the storm, the earth itself began to fail. Workers nearest the front of the iron monster saw the tracks bend first. Steel rails twisted upward with a violent metallic scream. Timber foundations snapped beneath the machine's forward weight. One side of the embankment collapsed directly into a hidden ice trench opening beneath the snowpack. Then the ground disappeared. Several rail wagons behind the machine slid sideways into darkness almost instantly. Chains tore loose. Wooden support structures shattered beneath collapsing earth and ice. Men carrying lanterns vanished in the white chaos before nearby crews could even see where they had fallen. The iron monster lurched violently to one side. Its massive steel wheels ground against fractured rail while steam exploded upward from ruptured pressure pipes. Operators inside the control section fought desperately to prevent the machine from overturning into the collapsing trench below. If it rolled completely off the line, the entire valley crossing could become unusable for months. And the Soviet winter supply schedule depended on this corridor opening before January. Inside the blizzard, visibility had fallen so low that many workers could not fully understand what was happening around them. Some believed enemy aircraft had bombed the line. Others thought an ammunition train had exploded nearby. Wind swallowed shouted commands before they traveled more than a few meters. Still, the crews reacted. Mechanics rushed toward the damaged undercarriage carrying portable lamps shielded beneath heavy coats. Emergency teams dragged timber beams across unstable ground to reinforce the remaining track bed. Furnace operators continued feeding coal into the boilers because loss of steam pressure would permanently immobilize the machine in sub-zero temperatures. The iron monster stood half-tilted, above the collapsing trench like a wounded fortress. Steam hissed from broken valves. Ice formed instantly around exposed metal. Some workers later described the scene as looking like a locomotive, hanging over the edge of the world. The storm intensified. Snow buried tools moments after they touched the ground. Wind drove frozen particles hard enough to cut exposed skin. Several workers became disoriented and wandered away from floodlights into open darkness, where rescue crews struggled to locate them. Yet the greatest danger remained beneath the machine itself. Engineers feared the remaining embankment would collapse, entirely under continued weight stress. If the central support failed, the iron monster, rail sections, supply wagons, and nearby crews could plunge directly into the frozen trench. Below, commanders faced a terrible decision. Abandon the machine and save the cruise dot or attempt emergency stabilization and keep the rail project alive. The answer came quickly. The railway had to survive. Orders spread through the valley despite the storm. Reinforce the embankment. Protect the machine. Continue operations. Hundreds of exhausted workers moved into the collapse zone carrying timber, chains, rails, and excavation tools. Teams hacked frozen earth apart by hand, where machinery could no longer operate safely. Others crawled beneath unstable sections of track, securing temporary supports, while snow buried them waist deep. The work continued through the night. Men froze where they stood. Several were crushed during secondary collapses. Medical shelters overflowed with frostbite injuries, broken limbs, and steam burns from ruptured pressure systems. Doctors worked beside furnace heat because surgical instruments froze against exposed skin in unheated tents. And through all of it, the machine remained alive. Its boilers still thundered. Its furnace still burned. Its steel frame groaned against shifting ground while operators fought to keep balance across fractured rails. By dawn, the storm finally began weakening. What emerged from the snow looked less like a construction project and more like a battlefield. Collapsed embankments stretched across the valley floor. Freight wagons lay half-buried beneath ice and debris. Torn cables hung frozen in the wind. Workers moved silently through smoke and drifting steam, searching for missing crews beneath shattered timber. But the iron monster was still, standing, damaged, tilted, partially immobilized, yet standing. That fact alone changed everything. Emergency. Engineering teams immediately reorganized the entire operation around, salvaging the crossing before deeper winter conditions arrived. Additional labor brigades were transferred into the valley. Replacement rails and support structures arrived by temporary sled convoys. Military Logistics Command elevated the sector to strategic priority status. The collapse had revealed something larger than a construction accident. It exposed how fragile the Soviet supply network still remained. One destroyed rail corridor could delay ammunition deliveries to entire fronts. One failed crossing could interrupt industrial shipments critical to tank and artillery production. In a war increasingly decided by logistics, infrastructure itself had become a battlefield. And despite the disaster, the railway continued advancing. Slowly at first, then relentlessly. Within weeks, temporary repairs restored movement through the valley. Freight trains carrying fuel, machinery, timber, and military supplies began crossing sections that had nearly vanished beneath the storm. Engineers reinforced the foundations with layered timber and stone while excavation. Crews widened unstable embankments. Before spring thaw arrived, the iron monster returned to operation soon afterward, by damage, repaired with mismatched steel plates. Its crews smaller, now after the losses inside the valley, but still moving forward. And as Soviet offensives gained momentum during 1943, the railways carved through frozen wilderness began feeding the enormous industrial machine that would eventually push Germany back across Eastern Europe. The workers who died beside those tracks would rarely appear in victory parades. Many construction sectors remained classified for years. After the war, some camps disappeared entirely beneath later development or wilderness growth. But the rail lines endured. Steel paths cut through territories once considered impossible to conquer, and through them flowed the resources, weapons, and movement that helped sustain one of the largest military recoveries in modern history. By 1943, the balance of the war had begun to shift. The German advance that once seemed unstoppable was slowing across the Eastern Front. Soviet industry, evacuated and rebuilt far beyond the reach of early German offensives, now produced tanks, artillery, aircraft, and ammunition in numbers that stunned foreign observers. Entire factory cities had risen east of the Ural Mountains with astonishing speed. Behind that recovery stood transportation. Without rail movement, Soviet industrial power could never have reached the battlefield at the scale required for survival. The frozen rail corridors carved through northern wilderness. Sectors became part of a vast logistical web stretching across continents. Freight moved from Arctic ports toward industrial centers. Coal and iron traveled from remote extraction regions into wartime factories. Fuel shipments crossed enormous distances toward frontline armies preparing new offensives. The railway lines, once viewed as desperate emergency projects, were now strategic arteries, and the Iron Monster became part of the mythology surrounding that transformation. Official, wartime reports rarely focused on individual machines. Yet, internal engineering documents repeatedly emphasized the importance of heavy rail construction equipment during emergency expansion programs. Machinery capable of operating in frozen sectors dramatically reduced construction times that manual labor alone could never have achieved during wartime conditions. But victory carried a hidden landscape beneath it. Across remote rail sectors, abandoned camps remained scattered through forests and tundra. Temporary worker settlements emptied as projects moved onward. Broken machinery rusted beneath snowdrifts. Timber grave markers disappeared during spring, flooding, or winter storms. Thousands of laborers never returned home. Some died in accidents beside heavy equipment. Some froze during transport operations. Others disappeared quietly from disease, malnutrition, exhaustion, or exposure in isolated sectors where medical systems barely functioned. Precise casualty numbers remain difficult to establish even decades later. Many wartime rail projects operated under overlapping civilian, military, and prison labor administration systems that kept incomplete or fragmented records. Historians studying Soviet infrastructure expansion during the war often encounter missing documentation, contradictory reports, or heavily censored archives from strategic transportation sectors. Yet survivor accounts reveal the human scale clearly enough. Workers remembered hearing steel crack in temperatures so cold it sounded like rifle fire. They remembered sleeping beside boilers for warmth, while storms buried camp entrances overnight. They remembered carrying frozen bodies away from track sections before the morning shift began. And they remembered the machines, especially the largest ones. To some, the Iron Monster symbolized endurance, proof that industrial power could force civilization into landscapes previously untouched by permanent infrastructure. To others, it symbolized the indifference of wartime systems willing to sacrifice human beings for schedules and output targets. Both interpretations were true. The Soviet Union's wartime recovery depended heavily on its ability to move production eastward, protect industrial capacity, and maintain supply flow despite catastrophic territorial losses during the early war years. Rail construction in frozen territories helped make that recovery possible. But the cost was immense. The environment itself amplified every hardship. Severe cold destroyed equipment and bodies alike. Isolation prevented quick evacuation or repair. Seasonal thaw cycles repeatedly erased months of labor. Entire engineering sectors operated under emergency pressure, where safety became secondary to completion. The result was infrastructure built with astonishing speed under conditions few modern industrial projects would tolerate. And still, the lines expanded. By late 1944, Soviet offensives stretched westward across Eastern Europe. Supply trains carrying tanks, artillery shells, fuel, and reinforcements moved continuously toward advancing fronts. Rail hubs once threatened by German invasion now supported the push toward Berlin itself. In strategic terms, the railway war had been won. Germany increasingly struggled with fuel shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and Allied bombing campaigns targeting transport networks. The Soviet Union, despite unimaginable losses, maintained the logistical momentum necessary to sustain enormous offensives across vast distances. Transportation had become one of the defining weapons of the conflict. Not glamorous, not cinematic in the traditional sense, but decisive and deep in the frozen wilderness. The old construction corridors continued operating long after headlines moved elsewhere. Freight trains crossed valleys where workers had once dug foundations by lantern light during Arctic storms. Locomotives passed over embankments reinforced with emergency wartime engineering that somehow endured year after year. The iron monster itself eventually disappeared from frontline construction records, like many wartime industrial machines. It was likely dismantled, rebuilt into other equipment, abandoned after mechanical failure, or replaced by newer post-war systems. Machinery rarely received monuments. It was expected to work until destruction or obsolescence made replacement necessary. But the railways it helped carve remained permanent scars across the landscape. And with peace approaching in Europe, another question slowly emerged inside the Soviet Union. What exactly had been built out there in the wilderness? A transportation triumph? A graveyard? Or both at the same time? When the Second World War ended in Europe in May 1945, millions of Soviet citizens looked westward toward ruined cities, burned battlefields, and the long road of reconstruction ahead. But far beyond the victory celebrations, the northern rail sectors continued operating almost without pause. The war had transformed the geography of the Soviet Union permanently. Before the conflict, many frozen territories existed only as distant frontier regions, rich in resources but isolated by climate and distance. Wartime necessity changed that relationship forever. Railroads built under emergency conditions opened direct access to forests, mining zones, river systems, industrial settlements, and Arctic supply corridors once considered economically unreachable. Steel tracks altered the map itself. Settlements that began as temporary worker camps evolved into permanent industrial towns. Extraction industries expanded deeper into Siberia and northern territories. Freight traffic increased year after year as post-war reconstruction demanded enormous quantities of coal, iron ore, timber, and fuel. The wilderness had been connected to the state, and the state intended to keep it that way. Many wartime rail lines underwent major reinforcement during the late 1940s and 1950s. Temporary bridges were replaced with permanent structures. Emergency timber foundations gave way to heavier stone and steel embankments. New locomotives gradually replaced aging wartime equipment. But beneath those upgrades remained the original wartime routes, the same corridors, the same valleys, the same frozen ground where thousands had worked under impossible conditions. In several sectors, engineers discovered that hurried wartime construction created long-term structural problems. Tracks shifted unpredictably during thaw cycles. Permafrost damage destabilized embankments decades after completion. Entire sections required constant maintenance because the ground beneath them had never fully stabilized after emergency wartime. Excavation. Nature had not surrendered permanently. It merely tolerated human intrusion for a time. Even after the war, the environment continued fighting back. Engineers stationed in northern territories often described rail maintenance as an endless battle against ice, water, erosion, and cold. Steel cracked during severe winters, bridges warped under shifting ice pressure. Remote sectors remained vulnerable to storms capable of isolating repair crews for weeks. Yet the railways endured because the Soviet economy increasingly depended upon them. The same frozen regions that once seemed strategically important only during wartime now became central to post-war industrial growth. Resource extraction expanded dramatically across Siberia. Northern rail systems carried raw materials into factories, fueling reconstruction across the Soviet bloc. The wartime infrastructure became the foundation of a new industrial era. And still, much of its human story remained buried. For decades, public discussion surrounding labor conditions on remote wartime construction projects remained heavily controlled. Official narratives emphasized heroism, industrial achievement, and patriotic sacrifice. These elements were certainly real. Countless workers genuinely believed they were helping save their country during one of history's most destructive wars. But there were other truths as well. Prison. Labor systems contributed heavily to several remote infrastructure projects. Casualty rates in isolated sectors often went underreported. Emergency construction policies pushed workers far beyond ordinary physical limits. Entire labor detachments vanished into archival silence after projects ended. Only years later did survivor testimonies begin revealing the full emotional weight carried by many who worked beside the machines. Some remembered pride, others remembered terror. Many remembered both. Simultaneously, former workers described hearing the constant roar of excavation systems in their sleep long after leaving the rail sectors. Mechanics recalled hands permanently scarred from handling frozen steel tools. Operators remembered watching steam rise from giant machines against black winter skies while wondering whether the next shift would survive the cold. The Iron Monster survived in memory more than in records. No single machine carried that exact official title. It was a worker's name, a collective description born from fear, exhaustion, and awe toward the massive industrial systems dominating those frozen landscapes. And perhaps that made the name more truthful, because to the men living beside them, these machines no longer felt entirely mechanical. They felt enormous, hungry, relentless, machines that consumed fuel, steel, time, and human strength without stopping. Yet history rarely remembers infrastructure with the same emotion reserved for tanks, aircraft, or famous battles. Railways operate quietly in the background of war narratives. But wars on the Eastern Front were often decided, far from combat itself. Inside factories, inside supply depots, inside frozen valleys where workers fought the Earth hour after hour beneath furnace smoke and Arctic wind. The Soviet victory over Germany depended not only on battlefield resistance, but on industrial survival. And industrial survival depended on transportation across impossible distances. That reality turned rail construction into a form of warfare, not fought with rifles, fought with coal shovels, welding torches, steam pressure, frozen steel, and human endurance. Over time, forests reclaimed many abandoned camps, snow buried old foundations, rust consumed forgotten machinery left beside obsolete track sections. Some wartime routes disappeared entirely beneath later modernization projects, but traces remained. Old embankments, cutting through wilderness, collapsed, timber supports emerging during spring thaw, fragments of steel buried beneath moss and ice. silent evidence of a struggle against geography itself, and somewhere within those forgotten northern corridors lived the memory of the Iron Monster. The giant machine that helped carve railroads through frozen wilderness while crushing the workers who stood beside it. In the end, the Iron Monster was never truly about one machine. It was about an era when nations believed steel could overpower geography, when governments measured survival in rail tonnage and factory output, when frozen wilderness became another front in the largest industrial war humanity had ever seen. The men who worked beside those machines rarely appeared in photographs of victory. No, statues were raised for furnace, crews feeding boilers through Arctic nights. Few history books remembered the mechanics thawing frozen valves with bleeding hands while storms buried the tracks around them. Most disappeared into labor reports, transport archives, or unmarked graves beneath the snow. Yet the railways remained. Long after the war ended, trains continued crossing the same valleys carved open during those brutal winters. Steel still passed through territories once considered unreachable. Entire cities and industries survived because someone forced tracks across frozen ground at impossible cost. WWII, wilderness changed forever. So did the people who entered it. The Iron Monster represented both triumph and warning at the same time, a symbol of engineering powerful enough to reshape continents, and of systems willing to consume human lives in pursuit of survival, speed, and victory. That contradiction defined much of the 20th century. Industrial progress created miracles of transportation, production, and endurance. But it also revealed how easily human beings could become fuel for machines larger than themselves. And perhaps that is why stories like this faded into silence. Because beneath the pride of what was built lives the memory of how it was built. Darkness, in cold beyond imagination, under the endless sound of steel grinding through frozen earth.